What a privilege it is to be here with you. And for those who are watching on the internet, welcome. We've gone through 3 nights together, and the first night I talked about, who knows what I talked about the first night? Yes, not to follow your feelings, yes. And the second night? That's right, not to be posers and fakers. And the third night? No, that was the one I was supposed to preach, but I changed it. Yes, and it was being sent out like lambs among wolves. Yes. And so tonight we're going to talk about faith, how to serve faith, how to have faith, not fear. That's our talk for tonight. So I love stories, and you'll hear me say this anytime you hear me speak. I love to tell stories, and part of the reason why I love to tell stories is that I grew up in Jamaica, and we didn't have television. We didn't even have radio fusion, whatever they call it. We had lamps. We didn't have electricity. We had to pump the lamps. We lit the lamps and pumped the lamps to get light. And I was 16, almost 17, before I saw my first television set. And I saw it from a distance. Some people had it in their home, and I was passing by, and we saw the blue light, and we were all out peeking to see what it was. Yeah, I'm a poor girl from, God has been good to me. And because we didn't have any of those entertainment things, my grandmother used to tell Nancy stories. And only when I grew up, I realized that she was making them up every night, that there was no such thing. And only when I grew up, I realized she was telling the same story every night, just adding a little different something. But because she was able to weave those stories so well and entertained us so much, I fell in love with stories. I love to hear stories. I love to read stories. I love to read books, lots of books. And when I became a Christian and I started studying the Bible, I discovered that Jesus loved to tell stories because he didn't have television or electricity or any of those things, and that's how their families entertained the children, especially on Friday nights. They would get the children together, and the father would come in from the field where he would have been for the whole week, and they would all bathe and put on their Sabbath clothes. They'd have a special meal, and then they would tell the children the stories of Exodus and how God took them out of Exodus and brought them into freedom. And they loved to tell stories. And Jesus grew up like that, hearing those stories all the time. So he repeated those stories in his adult life. Many of the stories he told, especially the ones that he told when he was on the cross, were the words that he said when he was on the cross were related to stories that he heard as children and psalms that he learned as a child. So anyway, I could get carried away with this about Jesus because I'm in love with Jesus. I love him and I'm in love with him. And there was this. So when I saw that he loved stories, I decided that I'm going to make my ministry, I'm going to have my ministry one that is filled with stories. So here goes a story for you. This mother was washing her dishes in the kitchen, and her only son was off playing somewhere else in the house. And her son was afraid of the dark. He didn't like to, as soon as it got dark, he would stay indoors, and he slept with his light on all the time. He was just terrified of the dark. There's a radio that's playing that's affecting me, and I don't know where it's coming from. and if someone could just kind of close a door or something, that would be helpful, because it's distracting me. Yeah, it's something. It's music or something, and I'm a nosy Parker, so I want to know what's going on there and trying to speak at the same time, and it's boggling my mind. It's just distracting me. So anyway, this lady, she's doing the dishes in the kitchen, and as she's putting them away, a glass falls to the ground and smashes. And just without thinking, she called to her son, "Johnny, come here quickly." He ran into the room like an obedient child, and his mother said, "Can you just go out on the porch and get me the broom?" The only problem was that the porch was in darkness. There was no light out on the porch. So Johnny hesitated, and Mom said, "Come on, go get me the broom." And he said, "But you know I'm scared of the dark." And Mom said, "You don't have to be afraid of the dark. Jesus is out there on the porch, and he will guard you, and he will take care of you." And so Johnny, being a smart child, went to the door, carefully opened the door, and yelled out, "Jesus, if you're out there, could you please hand me the broom?" You know, fear is the greatest enemy of faith, and we all came by it naturally. From our first parents, Adam and Eve, as you know, we have this fear from our first parents, Adam and Eve. Because as you know, the first sign of their fall from the high position as co-partners in the planning of creation was fear. Fear of being found out that they had done what God had told them not to do. It wasn't just that they were afraid of being naked, they were afraid of being found out. And so they covered themselves with fig leaves. And since that day, we, the descendants of Adam and Eve, in our fallen nature, express fear and the consequences of our actions that create even more fear. We express it by covering up, by hiding the truth about ourselves. Since then, we all live with tendencies to evil, the root, and someone once said, "Evil is the root of all fear." This Christian author said, any fear you have, you can trace it back to something that is evil. And I thought that was very interesting. So he suggested, and I've come to believe, that the root of all evil is fear, the greatest enemy of faith. This fear has a profound effect nowadays. We're always worried about and focused on home and homeland security. Do you see how afraid we are? Everything is about securing our home. We put on so many locks that if something should happen inside and we're locked in, the emergency people would have a hard time getting into our homes. And if something should happen in our homes and we have to get out, we'd have a hard time getting out. We have so much fear. Homeland security causes cameras to be everywhere. There is no privacy anymore because of fear. This fear affects us so much that we live like prisoners in our own homes, behind locked doors and bars on our windows and bars around our homes. This fear is so potent, even our language is laced with it. For we speak of being afraid as easily as every breath that we take. You ever had this? You say to someone, "Can you see me 10 o'clock tomorrow?" And they say, "I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to make it." It's become such a natural part of our lives. You know, in the Bible, in the entire Bible, the phrase "be not afraid" is mentioned 365 times, one for every day, because God knew that fear would control our lives. God knew that fear would control our lives. That's why he inspired John to write in 1 John 4:18 that perfect love kicks out all fear, and I talked about that the other night on Wednesday night. Yet, in the words of a song that has been repeating in my head since I thought of this sermon, we've come this far by faith, leaning on the Lord, trusting in his holy word. And I added this, knowing he has never, nor will he ever fail us. He has never failed us, and he will never fail us, so we don't have to be afraid of anything. Therefore, despite what is unfolding in the world to cause us to fear, we must keep on living by faith. And women, don't do it. Don't live by fear. Actually, whether a person is good, bad, or indifferent, everyone lives by faith, and every faith is tested. Whether people believe in God or not, they live by faith. We all human beings live by faith, and every single faith is tested. However, those who live by faith in Jesus Christ are severely tested. Everyone's tested, but those who live by faith in Jesus Christ, because the world is controlled by Satan, everyone who follows Jesus Christ is severely tested. Their faith is severely tested. And sometimes our faith is being tested by God, and sometimes it's being tested by the environment in which we live that is controlled by Satan. But the thing is that the test, all of the tests, whether it's by God, from God, through God, with God, regardless of how we come by these tests, every test is to see if our faith has its firm foundation in Jesus Christ. That's how we know if our faith is firmly founded in Jesus Christ. As I've gotten older, I've come to recognize that our faith being tested is a permanent part of living in the world today, where everything is tested to prove its authenticity or that it is the genuine article. For example, practically every piece of precious metal, such as silver or gold, is given the acid test to determine its purity before it can bear the mint mark of its producer. In fact, because of that acid test, if someone wants to let you know that they're going to put you through a rigorous time, they say, we're giving you the acid test. It came from that testing of precious metal. A little light or some water or warm breath is the so-called fog test, used to determine if a diamond is real or fake. Bank tellers authenticate paper money by holding it up to the light, or they bite into coins to ensure that they're not counterfeit. Everything is tested. Some people test their parents. Some people test their business partners. Others test their church and home family. And some test their friends or even their foes, and almost all of us test God. And we do that in the hope of determining the exact value of that particular relationship. Quite frankly, we've all been programmed to test everyone, as well as to expect everything, even our faith in God, to be tested to determine its authenticity. And by the way, before we bristle under the bright light of this truth, I recently read that a faith that isn't tested is a faith that cannot be trusted. Let me say that again. A faith that isn't tested is a faith that cannot be trusted. Still, as much as we speak of faith, as much as we preach or teach about faith, I am often asked, what exactly is faith and how does it differ from belief? And here Here's the answer. Although faith and belief are from the same word in the original language, although they are often used interchangeably in the Bible, there are a few notable differences between faith and belief. For example, belief is active in that it always needs evidence to show that it exists. It always needs an action to indicate that it exists. So belief is what we do. So for example, if you came in here and you said, I believe that this chair can hold me, but you won't sit in it, you do not believe. It's not true. If you believe that a chair can hold you, if you believe that a bus will take you safely, you'll get on the bus. But if you stand at the bus stop and won't get on the bus, you don't believe. You're just saying the words. You don't have the actions to follow. So belief is what we do. It's action. It's active. On the other hand, faith is passive. Faith is defined as primarily firm persuasion or conviction based on hearing that which produces a full acknowledgement of God's revelation or truth. In essence, where belief must result in doing, faith is expressed in being or who we are. Belief, you have to do something. Faith, you have to live it. Faith is who we are. You can't do faith. You have to live faith. These descriptions are incomplete because belief and faith are really indescribable. Words alone cannot convey their full meaning. They cannot be explained as much as they must be personally experienced to be understood. So let me try to illustrate what I mean. Giving the meaning of faith is like trying to communicate your personal feelings and experience about a piece of music or a poem or a painting. And as you explain it in your heart, you know your listener, no matter how attentive they are, you know that they really don't get what you mean because they're not feeling what you felt. Even if they saw the painting or heard the music, because they felt differently about it, they cannot understand what you're saying about it. So faith is inexplicable. It has to be experienced. And every single person experiences it differently. Just as no two fingerprints or no two eye thingies are the same, so no two faith is the same. And it's a crime that is leading to a crisis in the Christian church because we're expecting everybody's faith to be alike. And it's impossible. We even say that we grow at different levels, but we also expect everyone to have the same faith. And it's impossible. So when you try to explain it to someone, they cannot comprehend exactly what it is that you saw, what it is that you heard or sensed that gave you confidence or faith in the value you're assessing to that piece of music or painting or art. You see, no matter how hard we try, and no matter how many words we use, no matter how many powerful gestures we display to convey the meaning, faith is something we are quite powerless to explain, much less teach another human being. And that's why in Romans 12, verse 3, the Apostle Paul asserted that it is God who gives everyone a measure of faith, because we cannot give each other faith. We might be able to inspire faith, but we cannot give each other faith. And, my dear friends, that gift, like conversion, must be personal, experienced, and exercised. Now, there is a gift of faith. Everyone is given a measure of faith, every single one. Even those who don't believe in God gets this measure of faith. That's why non-believers can get on a bus or sit in a chair, because they have faith that it's going to work. Every child of God, every human being that is born and has been born belongs to God, whether they're of another faith or of our faith. Everybody has been given this measure of faith. But there's a gift of faith that is given only to believers in Jesus Christ. And the Apostle Paul writes about it in 1 Corinthians 12 and so forth, where he talks about the spiritual gifts. And that's a different, it's still faith that has to be experienced and exercised, but it's not the same as the one that everybody gets. So faith is not a formula for instruction in Christian living. It is a divine gift that is more like a muscle, and we must develop this gift through exercise. The more we stretch it, the more God uses opportunities, the more obstacles we overcome, the more trials and temptations we encounter to test our faith. It is to test our faith and to show us whether our faith is genuine or fake. And too many believers in Christ have fake faith. That's the reason why our prayers are not being answered in the way that they should, because it's fake faith. And you know how I know? Every so often, God surprises us. We ask for something, we pray for something, and he gives it to us. And what is the first thing we say? I don't believe it. Yes. That's how I know that our faith is fake. Because if we believed it, we would be expecting it. Like this story about a man who, a town, a community, they were praying for rain. And I'm sure some of you have heard this illustration before. They were praying for rain, and everybody showed up in the town center because the drought had been for so long and it had devastated everything. And as they were praying, a young man showed up with his umbrella, and the preacher says, "What are you doing with this umbrella? You know that there hasn't been any rain." And he said, "But we are praying for rain, and I expect it to rain, so I came with my umbrella." But most of us pray for things not expecting it to happen because we have fake faith. And when Jesus tests us by making it happen, we declare to onlookers, "I don't believe it." So, he tests our faith so that it can grow bigger. And the more it grows, the more it's tested. Now, some people may disagree, and others may argue that God doesn't test us. I've been argued with over and over again. Even in the seminary, I've had students who've said to me, "God doesn't test anyone." Well, that's not so. The Bible is very clear that God tests and disciplines those whom he loves. Those whom he loves include all of us who rank among his children, as did Abraham, who is considered to this day to be the father of the three greatest world religions, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. I am convinced that although not all tests are from God, he does test, and he tests us by examining the story of Abraham in Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 through 13, I would like to share with you 7 tests that God used to prove Abraham's faith to him, to prove that Abraham's faith is genuine. He wanted to prove it to Abraham. So I want to share with you these 7 tests that God used, and I believe he uses those same tests in our own lives. So open your Bibles with me to Genesis chapter 22, and it's a familiar story. It's such a familiar story that I shouldn't even read it, but I will anyway. And I'm reading from the New American Standard Bible. And this is how it is written. The heading in my Bible is the offering of Isaac, beginning at verse 1, verses 1 through 13, Genesis 22. Now it came about after these things that God tested Abraham. See that? And said to him, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. He said, Take now your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son, and he split wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham raised his eyes and saw the place from a distance. Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey, and I and the lad will go over there, and we will worship and return to you. Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, and he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So the 2 of them walked on together. Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, My father. And he said, Here I am, my son. And he said, Behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. So the 2 of them walked on together. Then they came to the place of which God had told him, and Abraham built the altar there and arranged the wood and bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on the top of the wood. Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. And he said, Do not stretch out your hand against the lad, and do nothing to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And then Abraham raised his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in the thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up for a burnt offering in the place of his son. I would like to share with you these 7 tests, and I'm going to use S words so that we can remember them easily. And the first one is the submission test. The first one, the submission test. Let me set up this for you. Verse 1. It came about after the things written in up to chapter 21 that God tested Abraham. God tests his people. God tested Job. God tests his people to see if we are willing to submit to him. So God said to Abraham, Take now, not tomorrow, not midnight, but right this minute. And the reason is that when God gives us a command, if we don't move right away, it's unlikely that we will move at all. This is why he said to Abraham, Do it right now. Take your son, your only son. Now we know from what has been written that Abraham had another son. And according to the story, Ishmael was Isaac was born when Ishmael was between the age of 14 to 17. So you have to understand that let's use the number 14. For 14 years, Abraham raised Ishmael as his son and heir. Everybody knew this was the prince, Ishmael. And then one day, God said, obey your wife and send him away, because he was creating problems in the family and mistreating his younger brother, Isaac. So we know that Abraham had a son whom he loved. He loved him for 14 years. So why did God say, take your son, your only son? Because Abraham had not yet gotten over Ishmael. And none of us would, so quickly and so easily. And so God had to tell him which son he's talking about, because he still had Ishmael in his heart. He said, take now your son, your only son whom you love, the one named Isaac, the one of promise, the one that I gave you, not the one that you gave yourself. Because Ishmael had already been gone physically, but not yet emotionally. And so he said, I want you to take him and go to the land of Moriah. Now, Moriah means a place that is provided by Jehovah. Nobody knows where that place is. Any place. This is your Moriah. If you're here because God brought you here tonight, this is your Moriah. And wherever you are tonight as you're driving home, every traffic light that you stop at, that's your Moriah, because you don't know if you're going to make it to the next one. That's what Moriah is. It is a place that is not known till you get there. And so God didn't tell him, didn't give him directions, didn't give him an underground tube map and mark out the spots. God said, go. You've got to have faith to believe that not only would God say, go kill your son, when you were told that you do not participate in human sacrifice, and then to believe that he said, get up right now and take him and go, and I'll tell you when you get there. But Abraham surrendered, Abraham submitted to God, and this divine test of submission teaches us that we must learn to wholeheartedly submit all our rights to God in order to obey him, even if or when his instructions seem to contradict what we have been taught or believe. A lot of people are not experiencing miracles today because they say that's not what we've been taught. When I was called by God to enter the ministry, I want you to know that I used to teach in Sabbath school that God would never use a woman to be a minister. And the reason why I was teaching that was because I knew that God had said to me, go prepare so that I can use you as a minister. And when I finally had the courage to share it with my church, whom they loved me with a love that surpasses my understanding to this day, my beloved church members gathered around me in a circle, put me in a circle, knelt down, and they placed their hand on me, and they prayed, God, please take out the spirit of rebellion out of this woman and put a spirit of nursing or teaching in her. If I had followed their sacred prayer, which they meant earnestly, and they were not bad people. But they couldn't believe that God would tell someone to take their kid and sacrifice it, much more tell a woman to go prepare for ministry. And had I listened to them, I wouldn't be here today. So there are times that God will tell you something that he hasn't told and never ever told another person. And you've got to do it right away, because people like myself and others who care for you will be quick to tell you you're crazy. Because I've never heard of God telling anybody that before. Therefore, it can't be true. So when you get that test and when you hear that voice, submit yourself immediately to God. So that's test number 1. Test number 2 is the sensitivity test. And verses 3 and 4 tells us that this test demonstrates that submission isn't easy, especially when we must go against our beliefs and go not knowing where God is sending us. Verses 3 and 4 says this: Abraham rose early in the morning. Notice that he rose early in the morning before Sarah was awake. Because, being a woman, I imagine that if Abraham told Sarah what he was going to do, she would take a frying pan and smack him over the head and beat some senses in him. What? Take my son that I gave birth to in my old age when nobody's supposed to have a baby? You know, the people in their day, they had their babies when they were 13 to 18 years old, because women died like you would not believe, because they didn't have the medical things that we have today, and women died. So they had their babies, they married early, and they had their babies early when their bodies were young and strong and fit enough to survive. And you want to say that this lady had her baby at the 99, and you're going to take that child when he's 14 or 15 years old to offer him up as a sacrifice? No, no, no. You don't leave this house. So I'm sure he tiptoed out of the house early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men. Wait a minute. Didn't God say, take your only son? Meaning, like, don't take the children that you have with the concubines. But guess what he did? He took some of the sons that he had with his concubines. And I'm sure he took those 2 young men with him to barter with God. I'll give you 2 for 1, God. Isn't that what we do? When God tells us to do something that we really don't want to do, when God tells us to give up something we don't want to give up, don't we barter with him? God, I'll pay an extra 5% tithe if you let me keep this. That's what we do. We barter with God. And Abraham was a man just like a human, just like we are. And so Abraham saddled his donkey. And I love the King James Version. King James says he saddled his asses and took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son. And he split wood for the burnt offering, which was correct, which was okay, showing that he intended to follow through on sacrificing somebody, but not specifically Isaac, because he was going to barter with God and offer. So he took all of that and arose and went toward the place God had told him. And then on the 3rd day, Abraham raised his eyes and saw the place from a distance. Abraham was sensitive to the instructions of God, but he was also careful to barter with God. So the next S the separation test. So we start with the submission test. The sensitivity test means that you have to be sensitive to what God is saying, regardless of how others feel. Even if it's your dearest person in your life and they disbelieve what you're telling them God told you to do, you got to follow God's way, God's instruction. And the third one is the separation test, verse 5. This test teaches us that in order to faithfully follow God, there comes a time when we must leave all hindrances behind. Listen to verse 5. Abraham said to his young men when he saw the place where God had told him to go, and he realized that God was not going to barter with him, God was not going to change his mind, God had given him specific instructions. Abraham said to the young men, "Stay here with the donkey, and I and the lad will go over there and will worship and return to you." The separation test. When God tells us to do something that is against what we believe or what we've been taught, we have to leave behind even the good words of great people that we love. We just got to leave them behind and follow God. Abraham had to leave the two young men and the asses. And I'm telling you, women, too many of us have been carrying asses around with us. These donkeys that have dragged us down need to be left behind. You know, I had an interesting revelation one day when I was driving with another pastor. He was taking me to speak at his church in Los Angeles. And we came under the highway. You know, it's like networks, like webs, like spider webs, the highways in America. And we came up under many of those webs above us. And in the middle of the busy highway was a woman who had parked her car and was chasing after a dog that was running around on the highway. Here, the busy highway where cars are buzzing by, she's out there running after this stray dog, trying to catch this stray dog to put in her car to bring it to safety. And so the traffic stopped, people were yelling at her, people were saying, "Get in your car, you're going to get killed." But she was out there, come. Well, here's the revelation I had. As I saw her doing that, I realized that's exactly what I've done with my life. All of these stray men who don't have work, who don't have any education, who don't want any work, who don't want any education, running wild around the highway of my life, I stop in the middle of the highway to get them into my life. And you should hear me, "Come on, honey, come, sweetie pie, cooch. I'm an idiot. Women, don't do it. You've got to leave these donkeys and these dogs behind. When you see the place that God has told you that He's set for you, leave them behind. And even if you have to travel as an amputee with an arm or a leg missing, leave them behind. The separation test. Number 4, the setting test. Set your own stage test. Verses 6 through 9. This test teaches us that God has provided all the resources we need to do His bidding. Verses 6 through 9. Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac. What does that remind you of? the cross being laid on Jesus. This is called a Christocentric moment. The very words that described what Jesus experienced is here written thousands of years before. He laid the wood on Isaac, his son, and he took in his hand the fire and the knife. And I want you to know that from this place forward is actually a drama of the process of salvation. Don't miss it. God the Father took his own son and laid the cross on him. You can follow this story. And so Abraham laid the wood on Isaac his son, and he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So the two of them walked together, and it's written in the original language to indicate that they walked together in silence. Abraham couldn't say a word because his heart was too full. His heart he was having too much of a moment that he couldn't explain to his son that I'm taking you to make you a sacrifice. He couldn't explain it. He had no words. So in the original language, the tension is palpable. You can feel the tension, how he's walking and the kid is walking behind him or beside him, and he can't even look at his son because he knew if he looked at his son would see in his eyes what he was up to. And so he walks in silence with him. Verse 7, Isaac spoke to Abraham, his father, and he said, "My father." And Abraham said, "Here I am, my son." And he said, "Look, we have the fire and the wood that God has provided, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" And in the original language, Abraham doesn't answer him for a long time. Abraham couldn't answer him. So when Isaac asked him that question, they just walked on further in silence. And then Abraham finally answered, and all he could say is, "God will provide for himself the lamb for burnt offering, my son." I know we like to attribute to Abraham that at that stage he knew exactly what was going on, and so he knew there would be a lamb. No, he didn't know. It's a prophetic statement. It's a hopeful statement. It's a statement that says, "God, I'm going to put my faith in you, but if you don't heal my mother, I'm not going to feel good about it. God, I'm going to put my trust in you that you're going to provide something that will change what I'm experiencing. But if you don't, it's not going to be good between us." That's the kind of statement this was. And so the two of them walked together in silence. Isaac couldn't say anything. Abraham couldn't say anything. They walked together in silence. But this test shows us that God always provides every single thing we need to submit, to be sensitive, and to set up for the tests that he's going to bring into our lives. Number 5, the sacrificing test. We go back to verse 2 and verses 9 and 10 for this one. Remember verse 2? "Take now your son, whom you love," meaning that he had other sons that he didn't love. You know, he had concubines. Rich men had concubines in those days because during the period of menstruation, they couldn't touch their wives. And so they were allowed concubines, and Hagar was one such concubine. The difference was Hagar was a princess because she was the daughter of Pharaoh by one of his concubines. So when they picked Hagar to have Ishmael, they deliberately picked someone with royal bloodline if they're going to make up for what God promised them. They've got to get the best. And so he had other children. We know that later on. He had other children by his concubines. So God wanted to make it clear who he wanted him. And God says, take this boy, this young man, whom you love, and go to the land, which I'm not going to tell you where it is. I'm just going to provide it when you get there, and offer him as a burnt offering. And now to verses 9 and 10, because we're looking at the sacrificing test that demonstrate that sometimes we have to sacrifice something or someone we love in order to see God by faith. Verses 9 and 10. So then they came to the place of which God had told him, and Abraham built the altar there and arranged the wood and bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on the top of the wood. You know what? It really burns my heart when we preachers present this passage as if Isaac just said, okay, Daddy, tie me up and sacrifice me. Now, he was a young man, 14 to 17 years old. He was obedient, and I agree with what Ellen White has to say about this. He was obedient to his father, but just because you're obedient doesn't mean you don't wriggle and complain. Just because you're going to do God's will, how many of us do not cry and complain when God tells us to do something? We're going to do it anyway, but we're always saying, why God, me? When he was bound and laid upon the wood, I don't think he laid there silently. I think he was asking his dad, why? What are you going to do? Why, Daddy? In fact, we know that it scared Isaac for the rest of his life, because later on, when his own son, one of his sons, asked him, who is God to you? He said, the fear, because of that experience. So he laid him. I mean, Jesus himself didn't just go and say, okay, remember what he said? My soul is sorrowful unto death. Your soul ever been sorrowful unto death? It's because we've desensitized the crucifixion so much that people don't understand the awfulness of what Jesus experienced. So that when he was in the garden, he had this experience that is medically known that causes people who are highly stressed to cause their blood to come through their pores. And we just act as if, you know, he marched up to the garden and whatever thy will, God. Ellen White says that he fell in the garden and an angel had to come to strengthen him. It wasn't like he just walked in and said, okay. So let's not teach this story as if Isaac just laid there and said, okay, where's the knife? Hurry up and do it. Here is what the word says. When they came to the place, Abraham built the altar, and he arranged the wood. And I'm sure that Isaac may have hid behind a bush while he's arranging the wood. And Abraham had to go and get him by the hand and bring him, struggling to lay him on that altar and then bind him And then Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. Sometimes we have to take the knife to do radical surgery until God tells us, stop. The problem with 21st century Christianity and Seventh-day Adventism is that when God tells us to do something, because he's the one who told us to do it, when he tells us to stop, we refuse to stop. And that's why we have legalism. Because legalism starts out with the right intent, the right desire, but not knowing when to yield to God. Because then self takes over. So we have that test, the sacrificing test. Number 6, the spiritually flexible test, verses 10 through 12. This test demonstrates how important it is to allow God to change his mind as well as our minds. Listen to verse 10. Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son, but the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham! It's not like he said, Abraham, hi, sweetie. Whatever you're doing, don't do it anymore. Let me give you an illustration. I know in pictures that you see, they have Abraham with his knife raised like this. That's not true at all. No sacrifice was ever done like that. That's a Western idea. When the sheep is laid down, and they only allowed priests to do the sacrifices because the priests, when they did the sacrifice, they did it with tears in their eyes and thanksgiving to the animal for giving their life to sustain theirs. And when they lay them on the altar, they put the knife to the throat and they hold the knife there while they do the prayer of thanksgiving with tears dropping on the animal. And then in a second, they go, and it's done. So when Abraham put his son on the altar to slay him, the knife was pressed against the throat of his son when the angel said, Abraham! And his reaction was. And here's the story that we mustn't miss. Abraham dropped the knife, but God didn't. God caused his son to be sacrificed. When we tell this story, we must always remember how Abraham was given grace to drop the knife to save his son. But my God and yours, in order to save us, pulled that knife. Because he loved the world so much, the world that was spinning out of control, that he gave his only begotten Son, so that none should perish, but all, even me, should have eternal life. This is the spiritually flexible test. God will tell us to do some strange things, but always be in communication with him so that when he says, don't go any further, we stop and don't go any further. Finally, the surrender test. I don't know how anyone can preach and not sense the incredible power of this sacrifice. The surrender test, number 7, verses 13 and 14. This test addresses the importance of relinquishing every purpose to the plans that God has for us so that He can provide all our needs. Then Abraham raised his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in the thicket by his horns. And Abraham, so nervous that he went and took the ram before he cut his son loose. I believe that. He caught the ram first to be sure that he had something, and offered the ram up for a burnt offering in the place of his son. And Abraham called the name of that place, "The Lord will provide," as it is said to this day. And that place is called Moriah. Jehovah will provide, as it is to this day. In the mount of the Lord it will be provided. God is calling us. You know, the Word of God said, women, in the last days, God is going to cause His Spirit to fall upon us in a very special way. He's not ignoring the men. But if you notice, from the beginning of Christianity, the Christian church has been populated by more women than men. There are reasons for it. Not important for me to go through those reasons tonight, but that's the fact. So I'm speaking to us women that we've got to stop with the shenanigans, with the phony baloney worship, with praising God with our lips and not with our hearts. If you really believe that Jesus Christ is coming soon, it doesn't matter who comes into the sanctuary with their heads covered or not, as long as they're there. And teach them how to live. Because the Apostle Paul wrote that doctrines are for teaching us to live righteously. So don't turn them away. Don't push up your Jamaican mouth or your Caribbean mouth. I know how that pushing up the mouth can be, because those mouths have been pushed up to me so many times. I once came to England to speak. It was a huge convocation, at least 2,000 people there. And my sister, who was at that time not a Seventh-day Adventist, but has always been a plain Jane. She's never worn makeup, never put on lipstick, plain Jane. And no matter how many times I send my picture of this hussy, this Jezebel, whenever we're together, people go up to her and say, "Welcome, Pastor Williams." We've got to stop that foolishness. You cannot judge people by the way they look. We've got to stop that. Some people don't bother to brush their teeth. They come to church with bad breath. And there's nothing worse. The only thing that's worse than a Christian who's witnessing with bad breath is a dog that licks you in the wrong places. But we come to church with our bad breath and we want to tell people how to dress. We got to change that. And ladies, it's up to us. We've got to change. And we've got to take these tests. And then when our faith is proven authentic, then we have the right and the responsibility to go out and tell others how to live. And we've got to stop judging people by sight and look at the content of their characters, how they live. And if they're not living right, love them into living right. Ellen White says there is no one who can reject or avoid responding to unconditional love. I'm paraphrasing her statement. We've got to change. And I believe the best way that we can change is to take these tests. These 7 tests. And may God bless you as you go through them for yourself, remembering that the Word of God says, "Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all other things will be added unto you." And here's what I added to that scripture. And if you don't see them being added to me, it's none of your business. Let's make sure that our walk and our talk is approved by God. And may God bless you on this journey. It's a tough journey. But God is with you. And these are the words that he gave me to share with you tonight. And there must be a reason why he wants me to share these words. And I want you to know, I grew up in Jamaica, and my grandmother always said, be careful when you point one finger, because 3 or 4 are pointing back at you. So I'm not exempt from these words that I've said. And I'm committed to live my life for Jesus Christ. And there's nothing, and there's no one who's going to